is Störling-Enna. I'm the artistic director of Störling Dance Theater.
And I'm the executive director, Jeremiah Enna.
Why Book of Kells?
Well, I actually originally was only familiar with some of the imagery and didn't know very much about it until I saw a documentary. I was sewing costumes for a completely different production, just to entertain myself. I had YouTube playing and this documentary about the Book of Kells came on, and I was just so fascinated by the story and the beauty of the book that I just had to do something about it. And for those that don't really know what the Book of Kells is, it's a medieval illuminated gospel manuscript that contains the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And we've seen the imagery just our whole lives, but didn't really, wasn't connected to the deep story around it. It was just so fascinating. So when Mona came and said, let's study this more, it was a natural yes.
So what are some of those compelling elements from the imagery that really stood out to you, and how will they be portrayed in production?
I think that some of the imagery for me that just inspired me and when I started kind of studying it a little bit more was just the complexity. And I think a lot of people are maybe familiar with like those interlacing patterns and the famous Celtic knots. And the book itself has such fine detail in it that you actually have to have a magnifying glass in order to see all the details.
And they basically say they don't believe artists today could reproduce it because it's so intricate, and the craftsmanship is kind of a lost art, if you will. In the book, the symbol for the Holy Spirit is a wild goose as opposed to a dove. And so it's kind of an adventure to like figure out all the symbolism and what does it mean. And so for people who really love mysteries almost, it's fascinating to go through the book for that reason as well, the symbolism and the meaning behind everything they did in it.
In the production, we will have some of the images projected so people can actually see it. And I'm also partnering with a storyteller who has written this beautiful text about it, and we'll be reading it so people can really enjoy, looking at the imagery and hearing her talk about it. And then also we have a whole section where the dancers and their costumes the colors are based on the colors on the pages. And just the different, some of the knots and the patterns, and they sort of like reflect like a human version of the imagery.
The artwork, yeah.
Okay, so tell me about the monks.
The monks. Well, of course, the monks are a huge part of the story since the book was created in a monastery, but there's so many layers to that.
Yeah. So the Irish monks, were very like adventurous. They were brave. They were, in some sense, very extreme. Like they would build their monasteries like at the edge of a cliff or like somewhere, and it was sort of like a symbol of their, like, they're not afraid, we are brave, we are not afraid of evil, God is with us.
Right.
And
they would face the darkness and do things to push back the darkness, including, like you said, where they lived, how they went to help people. It's kind of hard for us. We live in the United States in this era. We're so comfort driven. But to see a people group like in Ireland that were driven by a higher purpose and a greater call, and lived very hard lives. So life being difficult was just accepted. Life is difficult. So what good can we do in this? And so the monks were that.
Yeah, and even like the dwellings that the monks would build, they were shaped as like beehives, and they saw themselves as the bees who would go out into the world and collect the pollen and whatever the bees get, the nectar from the flowers, and they would come back to their hives and they would make honey. And of course, honey is also the beeswax was useful to make candles. So it was like the light of the world, or honey was considered medicinal and also sweet, to the mouth. So they saw themselves as the bees living in these simple little beehives that would go out and then come back and make honey.
Cause life.
Yeah.
And you'll see bee imagery in the book.
Oh yes, yes.
Columba was the leader, the
Of
monk.
this particular mission.
Yeah, of this mission.
Yeah. And he was a very learned man. He came from a wealthy family. He came from kind of a warrior tribe, but then instead of becoming a warrior and a prince, he chose to be a monk. And there's a kind of a long story about that happens in the narration before the show that you will hear if you come to the show.
Yeah.
But what the monks in general, what they would do is they would, when the monastery would grow to a certain size, like about 100 men, they would always decide we got to split, like we can't become just huge. And some of them would be so they would just give themselves to the Lord and the Holy Spirit that they would get into a boat, and it was always 12 men plus one, and they would have no oars, and they would just let the wind take them, and wherever the boat landed, it was like, here we are, this is it, this is where we're going to start our next, monastery. So I just, that kind of inspired me so much, just the letting go of everything and just trusting
God where to be.
Yeah.
And of course, it was such a different time. This was a pagan culture. It was all kind of, life was very threatening, and you had tribalism. And so when we think of a monastery now, many of them are just museums, or the ones that have living communities are serving in a comfortable Western setting, if you will. Back then, they were going into very dangerous places to help protect the women and the children, to give a place to learn how to grow food and how to learn different crafts and things. So very different kind of setting they were going into. And Columba is the one that established the monastery where the Book of Kells was actually created.
Mm-hmm. And Columba was considered kind of a Renaissance man because he was a theologian. He was also an artist. They also said that he sang like an angel. So a very artistic person.
It was the triple threat of
Yes.
monks. Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about Columba. Sounds like he's a very vital part of the Book of Kells, writing the book and everything. So how will he be depicted in the show?
Well, we will follow his journey from leaving Ireland and then coming to the island of Iona. And he and his fellow monks will kind of see them, arrive at the island.
Yes, the book, the monastery, over 200 years. You've kind of compressed
Yes,
it.
I only have 1 hour, so
Yeah.
I had to condense the story quite a bit.
So
But,
it travels,
yeah.
in reality, the history travels across hundreds of years, but Mona's created, and the company have created one story that kind of includes all the elements.
I mean, being able to take that much history and putting it into 1 hour, I mean, what was that experience like,
Stressful.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's, you just have to kind of choose what can I portray? Like, what is going to be effective? What's going to bring the full picture together?
And what doesn't distort the history? Like, you still want it to be true, of course, and accurate as much as you can in a artistic expression on the stage. But that's also important, that as she picked the different, as we created the storyboard, as she picked those scenes, that it gave the right balance to show the true story. He is the one that established we want to make this book, but it took over 200 years. It was over 200 years in the making, and artists from all over, and artists who travel all over the world were part of the group over those 200 plus years that did the artwork. So you see a lot of different cultural influences from different lands in the artwork. And so people from other countries have seen it and say, oh, that reminds them of their Middle Eastern culture or something, the art there. So
And even the inks came from all over. Like, they came from Africa, they came from Persia. Like, they have used basically the best inks of that time, to create the book.
they wanted to create something that was as beautiful as the message of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And so that was part of their impetus, and they became famous for it. People had heard about it. But imagine 12, 1300 years ago, messages takes a long time for the word to get out. But it got out and people would travel, kind of take a pilgrimage to see the book. It was so beautiful.
They meet these people called the Picts, who were the indigenous people of Scotland at the time.
And the Picts, why were they called the Picts?
They were called the Picts, and it comes from the Latin word picti, which means the pictured ones, because they would tattoo their bodies, and they would also use, like, maybe if some of you have seen, Braveheart with the blue paint, they would paint their faces blue when they went to war. And so these are the people that Columba and his fellow monks encounter. And one of the things that made like the Pictish culture was quite advanced, and they were especially very advanced with metalwork. And but they also were cruel because they practiced human sacrifice. And we kind of see, in the story we will see how Columba and his monks, encountering these dangerous people, having to watch a sacrificial scene, and then still not leaving, not fleeing, but staying there and evangelizing these people.
And how do they bring the truth to them? It's a fascinating story of how they connect with them and serve them and also free them.
Yes, exactly. And how the people, they understood the gospel message very easily because of this whole human sacrifice element.
Because
so
of the
sacrifice of Christ. They were like, oh, okay, I get this. Like they understood it, and they also were very free. They were finally free from having to do this every year, to sacrifice people to the God or the gods,
the unknown God. One of the fascinating things about the story, which comes out later in the stage production, is when the Vikings come. And they come and they raid the monastery. And
the reason the Vikings are invading is because there's a famine, going on in Scandinavia, so they have to go out and they have to get, food and things. So, but they knew that monasteries usually had storage, and they had sacred vessels, made of gold and silver and all of that. So they come and, of course, kill most of the monks. It's recorded in history. And they find the book, and they don't necessarily care about the book, but they care about the cover, which is made of silver and has precious jewels on it. So they take the cover, rip it off, and they throw the book in a ditch, where it's then lost for 30 days. And people are looking for it desperately, because it's almost like the book is more valuable than the cover at this point.
Yeah.
And they find it after 30 days, and that's when they.
So there's this great irony that they grab the treasure, they rip the cover off and throw the treasure away, and the cover had some value, of course, at the time.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah, it was worth something to them, but they probably pulled the jewels out. They didn't have any appreciation for the artistry part, just the raw materials. But it's kind of ironic that they went and did this huge invasion, and then they had the treasure in their hands and they tossed it away. They didn't know what they were holding. And then there's this another part of the history that we can't show in the production, where there's the map, path that the book took over then the next 100 years. Yeah, to save the book and protect it, because people were trying to get it. So, and it ends up in the town of Kells. So that is why it's called the Book of Kells, because that's where it ends up resting, finding a home, finding protection.
And people, see it every year.
They travel to see it, and they turn one page a day.
Yeah.
You can see one. They have displays of images of the book, but every day you can see the actual book, and they'll just turn one page.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. But you have a book that is so valued and threatening, and it's everything, that it is being captured and hidden and traveled, and that's so beyond what we experience, to value something like that. And I think that also speaks to the ideas. It was full of ideas that were shaking things up. And so I think that makes it almost an adventure story, but set in, it's in reality. It's not just a fantasy story, but it has all the elements of some of our favorite kinds of stories.
What I'm really focused on in the story, the stage production, is kind of like the condensed version of the evangelization of Scotland, in this case it's Scotland, and how that happened. How did it change the people? How did it change the culture? And then also focusing on the beauty, of the book itself and the intricacy of it and what it took to create it. And then what a huge loss it was to almost lose it.
And even having not seen the production yet, the first thing that kind of pops in my mind too, that it sounds like a story of survival, all that the book has gone through to still be on display today.
That's right. Definitely. It is a great story of survival, not and of the book, but also of people. And the people who tasted something better than kind of this barbaric, tribal warring, and they wanted something better. And so it was all connected. So definitely a story of survival and hope and beauty.
What are some other things that you think the audience should know before they come to see it?
Well, the Book of Kells, as a stage production by Störling Dance Theater, I think you've been working on this for 4 or 5 years. I mean, this has been a long process, and we actually went to Scotland and did some research, and we visited an island called Lindisfarne, which is another hub of spiritual history, the Celtic Christian community there. So we've done a lot of research and behind this, and then you finally, get to bring it to the stage. How have you let kind of the history and the book formulate just the design of the show, the costumes, the lighting, even the choreography? Have there been any particular inspirations for you in your laying out of the choreography?
Yeah, so I did some, with the costuming, for example, I've done some research and finding out what was the clothing like that people wore. And interestingly enough, a lot of the clothing from that era, the Viking clothing and the clothing that the Celtic people or from that era is very similar. Like the embroidery, with the knots, that's really a part of all the artistic expression in the area, and even in Viking culture, Nordic culture too. So I think those patterns really inspired me. When it comes to the women's clothing, has stencils of the designs and the knots, and then I would say the other costuming that I was inspired by was the scenes that we do with the projections, where I took the colors of the book and I hand dyed the costumes to match the colors.
Another aspect I really love of what you've done is she uses the birch tree, which is very common in the area. And so there's a whole forest of birch trees that are on stage as a part of the show, and creative way of how those are used. But that really kind of locates you to know you're in the north of Europe, and I think that's been an important element.
Yeah, that's been a very important element of the show. Is using the trees, first of all, to create different locations, but then also to just use them creatively. They move around a lot.
Well, and also the music.
Yeah.
The music of the show is stunning. And both some traditional melodies and things, but also brand new music that's Celtic inspired, that creates one sound, if you will. But the music is worth it alone. You can close your eyes and it's worth the ticket. I mean, it is
beautiful, and I think a lot of people, anyways, really enjoy, Celtic music.
Yeah,
it's very popular as well, and so it's been really rewarding for me need to be hunting for that and creating the soundscape, which really creates the landscape and adds to the drama, adds to the emotion of all these different moments. And by the way, the music is all either sung in Gaelic or Latin. So it's the languages of the time that you hear. Some of the imagery in the book that really inspired me choreographically was the whole image of the vine. And that going back to the scriptures, Jesus talking about, I am the vine, you are the branches. So that really inspired me in the section that is the one where we project all the images and which becomes sort of like a church scene. And that there are some very complex, formations that the dancers create, and it's just really beautiful. And I think that section is really kind of intoxicating with the music.
And the vines are very complexly woven together in the book, and so you've taken from it.
One of the things that inspired me was that they honored the gospel so highly that they would literally put their entire, everything they had to make it amazing.
Yeah.
And
They devoted their lives, which meant material development wealth too. They forego that so that they could devote their craft to create this book.
Yeah, and some of the complexity that is in the imagery, I think was really inspired by the complexity of creation.
Yeah.
God's creation, and they somehow tried to depict that through all those knots and spirals, and then there's peacocks and birds and geese and all the little nature that's woven into that.
You talk about artists and their role in this time as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Columbus, the monastery, there was a lot of training that went on in practice, but they came from all over. Most of them were from the region, as you said, but then they trained to get more artistry. But
the monastery at its height on Iona, it's recorded that there were 3,000 people involved, not necessarily as monks, but involved in the community. People came all from all over the known world at the time to spend time there and to learn from the monks, because Europe at the time was being raided by barbarians, and a lot of the libraries were burning and books were being destroyed. So it was really the Irish and that area
and
that
the monks
preserved.
Right, and there's incredible history of the Scottish and the Irish people, and how they saved civilization, during that period. It's also, when you think of the book and you think of the painting, you think of the artists who were painters, but there were so many people involved, like those who made the vellum, the leather paper that it was painted on. That was a whole incredible process.
And they had to raise the calves. It was a huge undertaking.
Yeah, so there were all kinds of artists involved. In the metalwork, the cover was covered with jewels, precious jewels and silver, metalwork, and so it was a very complicated effort. And I just think it's fascinating, the thought of something taking 200 years. That means that the original visionary, of course, passes away, and that vision continues. And that alone is just fascinating, that something so rich and powerful was accomplished.
And there's some kind of fun things about it too. Like there's a couple of places in the book where clearly the monk was bored, and, and there's a little
napkin
funny little scribbles, like a little poem that he wrote about.
Aiden was here,
Yeah, the book was mainly created on the island of Iona. That's the main place.
That's where the monastery was.
But it was after the Vikings raided that they fled. They had to flee with the book.
I think it's just so important that we look at these historic pieces, this production based on history, and we have to remember to take off our lens, our 21st century lens, to see it more clearly. And so, we look almost romantically, I think, at the past. And so we think, ooh, the pigs, they had tattoos and they wore face makeup and it's kind of looks cool. But this is a very cruel culture, you know. And so it helps to remember those things so we don't romanticize periods of time and efforts, and see then the power of what happened when these monks came in. So I think time and place is so important in it. And a lot of, you know, when you say tribalism, a lot of people think of African cultures, a tribe in Africa. Tribalism was all over the planet. That's how it ran, on little groups of people, families, extended families. This is how people survived. And so that's a big part of the culture that these monks came into, to bring people together, to bring unity through.
And they really unified, you know, the tribes, because it was very tribal culture. They were always warring with each other. And when the monks came and, you know, and people started becoming Christians, it unified like the entire country.
Right, so the country went from warring factions to one people because of this message, this Christian message. And I think that's pretty important, you know, to look at in the history of Scotland, Ireland, and even Europe.
And in helping, I guess, the audience to connect with a story like this that is so rich in history and, you know, so, I guess, far disconnected years-wise, how do you try to make that happen, you know, help the audience to make that connection so that they, you know, actually receive and get what they're supposed to be getting from it and not romanticizing the story and things like that?
Well, I think that's where your storyteller comes in. She really helps set the tone, because dance and even theater times can be abstract, but Mona's engaged this professional storyteller that knows the history well.
Yeah, and she's amazing, and she's actually an expert on Irish history. Like, that's her passion, is Ireland. So, and she's incredibly, you know, knowledgeable and such a good writer, that she is basically like talking about some of the elements that's impossible to make through dance, so that people have an idea of, okay, this is where we are now.
So I think that was a really good move, because it's not a familiar story. You know, if it's a familiar story that we all know, it's easier to present it. But I think that was a really good move. But she's going to be dressed like the other performer. You know, she's going to be a part of the show.
Yeah.
So she's kind of like a narrator of sorts.
Yes.
Yeah.
She'll be the narrator, walking us through the story in the audience.
Yeah.
There's other parts of history during those periods where the Vikings and the Nordic people, they talk about hard lives. I mean, the land is frozen. You know, it's hard to grow food, and it's hard to survive. And the Christian people in the other parts of the country, I'm not talking about Ireland now, but often they would not go to share the good news or to share things. And so the Vikings just went down and took it. But with that, they also took with them people, slaves, and the message of the gospel. And one of the ways Scandinavia was transformed by the Christian message was because of that. They would kidnap people, bring them with them, and they were Christian people, and so especially women. And so they would have children by the Vikings and raise them as Christians. So it's all kind of interwoven. It's a very complex history, but even when bad things would happen, God would bring something good out of it.
The Irish women and the women of that whole like region were also considered like leaders. They could be leaders. So you had like in their culture, like with the Druids, you know, you had Druid priestesses. And so when this area was Christianized, you know, you could have had a monastery where actually the abbess, you know, was in charge of men. So that was very different, I think, from mainland Europe. And there are many powerful female saints, like Saint Bridget, you know, who comes from that area.
But in general, even the Viking culture the women were, like you said, seen as leaders, and even the men would go off to war to hunt, and the women were in charge of the community.
And the farm. And
You know, they
Yeah.
didn't expect like any of the men to stay behind, and so it was a unique culture, I think, in the north there, where the women were considered strong. It was okay for them to be strong. Well, Mona comes from Viking roots, so
Yes, I'm originally from Finland. So, yeah, the Vikings are my ancestors.
and to this day, those Scandinavian women are still the same, I might add. So
Still very independent.
that's right.
So it sounds like there's a lot of just powerful themes and lessons that people will be able to take from this production. And we talked about some of them, but is there another one or another two that we haven't touched on that, you know, would probably come through the show?
I think one of the things that come through in the show that was important for me was there's a character called Rikta whose daughter is sacrificed. And when she encounters the monks, or they encounter her, they come to her as she's sitting with her, daughter who's died and been basically thrown in a bog. And what really changed her was the kindness of the monks to care for her and to give this girl a proper burial. And that is really like what changes her, is that this is different. This feels different, like authentic love, authentic care for someone. And she then becomes the first convert, and we kind of follow her as she goes back to her community, as a different person, and that then causes other people to see the change
Especially
in her.
considering what she'd been through, losing her daughter to this ritual and this tradition that they couldn't fight. It was a part of their culture. They couldn't stop it. And so here she comes back radiant, and they're like, wait, something's different. I think also seeing truly great art, and in this case, we're bringing it in a different form. Obviously, we don't have the original, but hopefully that's inspiring, that inspires people to lift their eyes to beauty, lift their eyes to something better, something more, not in that kind of rigid, perfectionistic way that makes you feel I can't do anything, it's too high, but in the way that lifts everything you do up. It inspires you to do that little bit more, to make everything a little bit better, to care a little deeper, to work a little harder with joy in your heart. And I think hopefully that's something I think the Book of Kells can do now. 1,400 years later, it can still inspire that in us. Getting to study this incredible book, because we have a copy of it at home. Did that kind of raise the bar for you as far as what excellence was?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just the creativity in the book, the beauty, the intricacies, just the fact that you need a magnifying glass to see the details. And then the people who research it say that the interlacing, the over, under, it's like perfect.
It reminds me, one time years ago, I was in Norway, in Trondheim, Norway, and we were being given a tour of the cathedral in Trondheim. And it's a beautiful building, of course, but Book of Kells reminds me of this, because as we got a tour, we went up into the dome, which is, way up, and I'm afraid of heights, so I remember it viscerally. I'm like, oh my gosh. And they had this little door about this big, they would open, and the laborers or the cleaners could then crawl out on this little ledge that goes around the dome to clean it. And the person giving us a tour said, now look at the back of this fence that was decorative, and you'll see, what do you see? And what you saw was the exact same detail of the fence that was on the front of the fence that people in the church could see. And he said the artist did that because God is everywhere. So he can see everything, and they didn't want this like pretty fence outside but then plain in the back. And I think the Book of Kells reminds me of this idea that they made it for people, and they made it for God.
Yeah, for God's glory.
For God's glory, and the detail mattered, and it wasn't efficient. It wasn't practical, and that really speaks. That kind of shakes me up, because in modern culture, efficiency is so important, and practicality is so important. And this was just ridiculously generous and gorgeous and way beyond what you would do if you were being practical or a spendthrift on something. This was really luxurious. And so I think that says something. Not that everything can be like that, but depending on what you're doing, whether it's for God and for people, it might inspire me to do more and to do better. One of the things, of course, is that this is going to be an incredible show, and one of the main reasons why are the performers, the artists in the show. Mona's had the privilege, she has the privilege to work with some of these dancers have been in the company for 12 plus years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they have grown together. They're excellent dancers and technicians, but also artistically how they work together, how they tell stories. And then you add to that some special guest artists that are a part of it. And you have a really world-class moment to be a part of and seeing the Book of Kells. So I can't say enough about the dancers in the company. They are more than just performers who walk in and learn a step and do it. They really work with you.
They are, and they're really creators themselves too. I mean, several of them have really amazing choreographic talent themselves.
Right.
So I feel very honored to be working with these people.
Yeah, they're incredible. Sean Glass is doing the lights. He's just one of the best, and we're so grateful for him. And so it's really a gathering of artists to put this on. And while Mona is obviously the lead, the person who's crafting the main things in the choreography, she is fortunate to work with such amazing talent.
I think the favorite part of the process is just to see the dancers themselves bring out the characters, seeing like all of these people that I told them about come to life, and it's just really rewarding, and it makes me excited to actually see the show myself once I'm sitting in the theater, and then just their dedication, their professionalism, the work that goes into it, just alone having to do a 1.5 hour, warm up in order to even start rehearsing. Their energy and their dedication is just mind-blowing.
It's phenomenal, and I look forward to that too. I've seen these artists grow, and I am just like anyone in the audience. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, wanting to see and experience this. So it's going to be wonderful. When you come see the Book of Kells, this story we've been talking about is Act 2. But in Act 1, it's a variety of small pieces that aren't a part of the Book of Kells story. And for the premiere here in Kansas City, we have live music from a Celtic group, Jump 2-3. They're phenomenal musicians. And so in between those pieces, we'll have live Irish music and Irish-inspired music for the audience. So that's going to make it really special. One of the things that also inspired us to put it on the stage this year is that we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. So we landed from our little boat in the sky.
Yes.
We landed 25 years ago in Kansas City, and to start the Culture House and to start Störling Dance Theater. And so when we thought about what do we do to celebrate 25 years, we knew we wanted to ask Mona to create a new work, and we wanted to premiere it. And so this event is a part of the celebration that we're going through to put new work out there for the city, for the community, and to celebrate the goodness that we've experienced living here. So that's a big part of our excitement as well. And we hope that people who come, even if they've never seen the company, that we're just doing this for them. Come see something beautiful. Come, lift your spirit, and we hope we're just thankful to be a part of the city.
The show is going to be at the historic Folly Theater May 13th and 14th at 7 p.m. So everybody make sure and get your tickets, and I think you will be very inspired.
Now, this is the premiere, and so we're putting a lot into it. So 2 shows, 7 o'clock, 13th and 14th. And you can go to the Folly website, or you can go to our website, Störling Dance, STORLING dance.org.